consciousness is what we really are. And as such, there's a lot of confusion about consciousness because everybody thinks that consciousness is the way they are conscious. It is very interesting to go back and see what happened to physics when physics realized that the movement of the stars and the planets and the sun was not actually around us, but caused because we are turning around. Because something phenomenal happened. For a few thousand years, there had been very intelligent astronomers and physicists who had all kind of great theories and new discoveries. But it went astronomy itself went into circles because there was no good system for it. Every planet, every system had to be calculated in its own way, which were all peculiar because people did not really understand how it worked. Once we accepted that the Earth is not in the center of the universe, it became possible to describe the movement of all the planets and the sun and the moon and the stars in an extremely simple way that is not approximate, but that is precise. And from that, we got the confidence, for example, to use our mathematical formulas to design things. Because we knew that our mathematical descriptions of physics actually work. And so we could make bridges that were much longer than anybody had ever built a bridge before. Skyscrapers that were much higher than anyone had dared to build before. And we ended up using the same basic trust in our mental images and our mathematics to develop our knowledge of electromagnetism, which we cannot even feel with our own senses. And nothing of modern technology could exist without that. So, from the 16th century onwards, physics made incredible progress, way more than it had done till then. Part was because we got ourselves out of the center. We realized that the world doesn't turn around the Earth. Part was because we became active. We started doing experiments. And finally, we became active in making things and making instruments that could help us to do even better observations. And the enormous progress that humanity has made in the technical field over the last 500-600 years is all dependent on these things. We have to do something similar in psychology. So in this course, we'll try to get first our understanding of consciousness right. Then with that, get a better understanding of how the whole of reality works. And then we'll see that that leads almost by itself to a number of basically simple and very effective methods of changing ourselves. And as we all know, problems can be solved either inside or outside. And it is the job of psychology to see to what extent they can be solved inside. And for that, we need that understanding of consciousness. So that's what we will start. As we already saw, the core problem is that we are too anthropocentric. Individually, we think that everybody has the same consciousness that we have. And collectively, we think that consciousness is our mental processing. But that's not true. We will only be able to understand consciousness once we accept that it is there all over, in everything. And only for some interesting reasons in us, it is identified with and tied up with our mental processing that takes place in the brain. So for us, our consciousness is indeed the awareness that our brain produces. But that's not true for consciousness in general. So we have first to understand what consciousness is, independent of that mental processing that takes place in our human brains. This is the reason that in the Indian tradition, which focused on consciousness for thousands of years, people paid so much attention and valued so highly the ability to silence your mind. Because if you stop these mental processes, you become aware of consciousness as it is in itself and as it is in everything. And so the Indian tradition came to the conclusion that consciousness is really the core of our entire existence. And it exists beyond the manifest reality, beyond the universe, before the Big Bang, really beyond any manifest reality. It pervades the reality as a whole, and it is in every detail. So consciousness is something pretty peculiar, and the most beautiful idea about this omnipresence of consciousness is in the Indian concept of Satchitananda, which I think deserves to be called one of the greatest intellectual achievements of mankind. The idea that everything that is in its essence true, Sat, true existence. Everything is conscious, and everything is full of delight, Ananda. Now, that doesn't correspond to our ordinary understanding of reality. And not everybody in the Indian tradition agreed with it. The Buddha, for example, did not. But there is a very deep truth in it. And we'll explain gradually more how it actually works and why it is so important for psychology. We have already discussed the big changes that have taken place over the ages within the Indian tradition. So we don't need to come back to it, except for mentioning that in many of the Indian schools of spirituality, the concept of Satchitananda was limited to the transcendent. But in our approach, which I think gives much more scope for the development of psychology, we'll assume that Satchitananda is the essence of everything in existence. Even in Western philosophy, till about 200 years ago, almost all great philosophers were convinced that consciousness was there in everything. In Europe it was called panpsychism, which is not exactly the same as the Indian conceptualization, because it misses out on the transcendent, but both have in common that they assume that consciousness is everywhere. In Western thought, it got lost because, obviously, rocks don't have brains. And so if we assume that consciousness is the kind of mental awareness of our surrounding that we have, then rocks cannot be conscious. But as we have already seen, that is actually a misunderstanding about consciousness. Because consciousness is something much more generic, which in us is linked to the workings of our brain, because that's the most important part of our biological existence. But there is something generic about consciousness also. So we'll try now to get a better understanding of that generic consciousness that is everywhere. We have already discussed that we identify with our consciousness. In the end, our consciousness is what we are. And if you think about it, everything that really matters to people, love, meaning, values, hope, happiness, unhappiness, pain, commitment, responsibility, effort, will, intention, purpose. Everything exists primarily in consciousness. None of the things I mentioned is primarily physical. They may have some correlates in the physical reality, but they are primarily things that happen in consciousness. And without consciousness, there would be no knowledge. There might be information, but nobody would know, because for knowledge, consciousness is in any case needed. So what is that consciousness? We identify with it, and so consciousness is to some extent transparent to us. Just as we don't see the inside of our eyes, we also are not aware of our consciousness. We are aware of the world around us. And as I already hinted at, in the Indian tradition, they realized how important consciousness itself was, and they found that the best way to understand what consciousness is to stop all that mental processing so that you get at consciousness pure. But we'll get back to that later. The Indian word for man, unfortunately, it is really, in modern Hindi, it is used really for man, but initially it was for the self. Means both the self and consciousness. According to the context, you have to translate it either as this or as that. So our self is very deeply connected to our consciousness. Now, the first fascinating property of consciousness, which is very crucial to understand how the whole universe actually hangs together, is that it is at the same time one and many. This is so trivial that nobody pays attention to it, but it is the core of the problem and the core of the solution. At any given time, we have only one consciousness, or rather we are only one consciousness. Even people with so-called split personality, at any moment, they have one. And that one combines sounds and ideas and images, maybe smells, all kinds of things, but they all combine into one whole. In neurology, that's called the binding problem, because they assume that our consciousness is kind of generated in the brain, and it's not very clear where it is combined. There is no organ for that. In reality, there doesn't need to be an organ for that, because consciousness is a whole and the parts at the same time in any case. And that is true, if you think about it, for absolutely everything. An atom is the subatomic particles that it contains, but it is also the atom itself. A story has people in it, it has adventures in it, things that happen, it has scenes, it has characters, it has a plot, and yet it is only one story. And this is true for anything that exists. And the fancy thing of consciousness is that we can, to some extent, move freely in that consciousness up and down. Because the oneness and the many is hierarchical. As I said, an atom has subatomic particles, but it is also part of a molecule. And the molecule is part of a fluid or of a crystal or of something bigger. Absolutely everything, maybe right at the bottom knot, maybe right at the top knot, but everything in between has parts and is part of something bigger. And consciousness is also like that. It is at any given time one, and it contains a variety of elements. At one stage, the Buddhists used this phenomenon to prove that nothing has a real identity, because everything is composed of elements. But I'm not sure that that actually holds. The fun is that at least at our human level, we have a freedom to move up and down in that hierarchy. We can concentrate on something. Out of all the billions of things that you could think of at this moment, you could think now about a green elephant, because I say green elephant. You may suddenly think of the house in which you were born, just because I mention it. You can also think about the earth. You can think about climate change. You can think about your life as a whole. At any given moment, you are free to move up and down in that hierarchy. And this is where actually the solution of all our problems are. Mostly it happens kind of by force. Something happens, you focus on it. Like when I mentioned a green elephant, you have to think of a green elephant just because you hear those words. If you are fast asleep, it won't have any effect on you. But when you are listening, you react. So to some extent, we are forced by circumstances. But we have also an amazing freedom to concentrate on what we want to concentrate on. And, as I said, this oneness and many is a hierarchy. And the hierarchy goes from the smallest subatomic particles that are completely fixed in their grooves, their habits, their laws of physics, right about up to the consciousness that has created the world, and even beyond. And the ancient rishis, in the Indian tradition, and many mystics all over the world, not that many unfortunately, but still quite a few, figured out a way of kind of going backwards and upwards, right up to the transcendent. And according to that principle of Satchitananda, the transcendent is absolutely full of unblemished delight. And when you're identifying with that consciousness, that is kind of wider than the universe, more eternal than the universe, you're also entirely you're not vulnerable anymore in any way. And your joy is intrinsic. So, to the extent that you have access to that kind of consciousness, you have a kind of holding ground. You have a kind of inner certainty from which you can deal with all the problems of the world. So, you are suddenly not anymore dependent on people being nice to you, on being supported, on anything actually. And to the extent that you have access to that transcendent joy, you are, if you want to, in a position to deal with everything objectively and in harmony with the whole. Because from that highest consciousness to our small consciousness, there is a ladder of consciousness. Unfortunately, in the Indian tradition, over the last maybe 2000 years, the stress has been very much on finding that absolute. And people gave up the idea of doing anything with that higher consciousness in this world. Because obviously when you are there, you don't have any intrinsic need to do it anymore, because you have no needs. But if this world has not been made just as a mistake or as a fraud or as some bizarre illusion, but if this world is going somewhere, then we can kind of make use of that higher consciousness to change the situation down here. And the whole idea of this approach to psychology is to see to what extent we can make that road between the transcendent purity of consciousness and our day-to-day consciousness in the body, in the society, in our work, more open. So that something of the power of the divine, the power of harmony, the power that actually has manifested this whole world, can begin to influence our human behavior more. And that brings us to the second point, and that is that consciousness is not only awareness, but is also a power. And interestingly, that is an aspect of consciousness that has been forgotten both in the Western tradition and in the Indian tradition. In the Western tradition, because science wanted to grow up independent of the church, and it wanted to study only the physical world, independent of beliefs and thoughts and superstitions and old ideas and anything else. And so it developed a system of understanding the physical reality as a closed system. And so there is, within that system, actually no place for consciousness as a power. But there is something almost childish in that idea, because when we humans make things, at the end we make them bottom up. A house or a temple or anything like that is built one brick on top of another. Anything. A car also is built entirely according to the laws of physics, mechanically, out of parts. But if in the beginning there had not been for that house a man with money and power and an idea of making something, the bricks would never have come on top of each other. Nobody would have asked an architect to make a detailed plan. The engineer would have been busy with something else. The clay of the bricks would have remained in the river. There has to be first an idea and a power to implement that idea. And that thing comes from top down, and from the other side there is something that goes from bottom up. And the two meet. And if you look only at the physical reality, you see only the physical process. Fine. That's a purely physical process. But the physical process would never have happened if there had not been a consciousness initiating it. That's the Western story about why science has lost its idea of consciousness as power and limited itself to awareness, which to some extent fits us, because in us, our brains spent a lot of their energy on just being aware of this surrounding and making a good map of it. So that for us, consciousness is primarily awareness is understandable. But in the process as a whole, it is only half the story. In the Indian tradition, consciousness, the power of consciousness, was lost for a very different reason. The Indian tradition was, for the last 2000 years, or a little more than that probably, very much focused on reaching that transcendent purity. And if you really want to reach the absolute, something that is 100% divine, no compromises, no half-baked situations, no plan Bs, just the divine, the absolute, the highest. The simplest way of doing that, though it is not easy, but it is still the simplest way, is to remove everything from your consciousness that doesn't belong to consciousness pure. In that purity of consciousness, you can find the divine, because your nature does not need to be changed very much. It only needs to stay out of the way. If you want to implement the power of consciousness, then your nature has to be obedient and has to be perfect. And making your nature perfect is infinitely more difficult than extracting your consciousness out of your nature. So while the older Indian manuscripts from the time of the Rig Veda, they are actually not manuscripts because they were not written down, but the text, they kept the balance. And these people were just there in their consciousness. But the later traditions kind of lost hope in doing anything with the physical world outside, and they wanted to find a shortcut, something to reach the absolute the quickest way possible. And that is also by focusing entirely on the purity aspect, the awareness part. Because power corrupts, and as they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely, but every little bit of power increases the chance that you trip somewhere over your ego. So power is very difficult to handle. And the Indian tradition just by and large left it. There is the Tantric tradition, there is Kashmiri Shaivism. There are smaller schools that have kept the interest in consciousness as power alive, but they are relatively small compared to the others. So both from the spiritual side and from the technical materialist side, the power aspect of consciousness has been left alone. And that's a very great loss. Because to live a responsible life, you must assume that people have at least some power to influence at least their own life. If consciousness had really no power, there would be no way of doing yoga. There would be no way of improving yourself. There would be no sense to law, to anything actually. To understand how the world works and to give any meaning to human life, you must assume that in the end we have some kind of freedom and some kind of power. And yes, it ends well only when we align our individual power to the plan, the harmony of the creation as a whole. But we have a freedom to do that or not to do that. Because to some extent we are independent entities. And we can voluntarily align ourselves to a higher consciousness, but it has to be voluntarily. So, the power of consciousness is very important, so I've also used several slides for it. The Purusha is the self and is in many Indian schools of philosophy used for consciousness. So it is traditionally very often equated with the Sakshi, the witness. But Sri Aurobindo says that is only the first step, that is the easiest part. If you look further inside, you see that your deepest self in some way upholds, supports the life you live. And that sanction is needed to continue your life. That sanction is needed to go on your way. And though in practice our power is very limited and we are largely just pushed around by all kinds of forces and habits, in the end we are the Lord of our own destiny, the Ishwar, which is kind of the individual ruler of an individual life, the divine in each one of us. But as I say, this is not something that everybody in the Indian tradition supports. There are many in the Indian tradition who will feel that Satchitananda is only a description of the transcendent, the pure consciousness. But for Sri Aurobindo, the world is also a manifestation of the divine. Maybe still in process, maybe work is still going on, but it is a manifestation of the divine. So at the core of absolutely everything, there is that pure being, pure consciousness, and pure delight. So being is also becoming. Becoming is kind of the dynamic aspect of being. Consciousness is awareness, but also power. And interestingly, if you think about it, it is only in us that we separate the two. And the most interesting, perhaps, is the one about delight, of which the active side is love. The will that there is delight in the person or the being or the situation that you love. Love and delight are also the receiving and the giving side of the same basic ingredient. And these differences between dynamism and the passive side, they may very well be limited to our human consciousness. Our minds are hopelessly dualist, and reality is absolutely not. So we will discuss how we can slowly grow out of all those dualisms, which really mess up everything. But okay, that will come later. If we leave the old philosophy behind, you could say that consciousness in everything is the thing that's responsible for its qualities. So passively in us, it is awareness. Actively in us, it is will, intent, the thing that guides, that creates, that rules the situation. If you want to summarize it very, very childishly and simply, you could say that everything, whether it is a thing or a mood, anything, needs to have at its core some level of delight, otherwise it would not want to be. And it needs consciousness in order to know how to be. Without consciousness, it would be shapeless, formless. And not even that. It would be not there at all. So, in the manifest world, consciousness is needed to tell things how to be. Beyond the manifest world, it is just its own self-awareness, its power, its freedom. That's a different story. But in us, it is the thing that creates, that gives a shape. And the great fortunate thing is that we have reached in the evolution a place where we have a certain freedom to move up and down in that hierarchy of consciousness, so that we can get out of our narrowness, out of our captivity in our problems and questions and all the things that are terribly serious for us, and reach consciousness where it is free and full of a kind of intrinsic delight, which we can not even bear, because our capacity to bear that level of delight is small. In the coming videos, we'll discuss more in detail how this consciousness works out in the different parts of our nature, how this vision of consciousness can help us to develop better methods, better tools of understanding the psychological reality, because in the end that is the immediate urgency for this series of videos. And in the course as a whole, after that, different people will explain how this whole understanding of reality can be used for different applications of psychology, counseling, self-growth, development, dealing with relationships, education, and so on. All right.